Drop in the world to where you are watching from. And don't forget to click subscribe, because this woman will make you feel loved by any means. She never meant to fall in love in the back seat of a car. That is the part nobody tells you about loneliness. It does not arrive all at once. It does not knock on your door and announce itself. It seeps in slowly, the way cold air finds the gaps in an old window frame, the way silence fills a penthouse apartment at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night when the city below is alive and loud and you are sitting alone with a glass of wine you forgot to drink. Her name was Victoria Calloway, 35 years old, Chief Executive Officer of Callaway Meridian Group, one of the most aggressive real estate development firms on the East Coast. She had built that company from a single inherited property into a portfolio worth $400 million. She had negotiated contracts that made grown men sweat. She had fired 3 CFOs in 2 years. She had stood in front of boardrooms full of people twice her age and made them believe every single word that came out of her mouth. She was, by every external measure, extraordinary. And she was completely, devastatingly alone. Not in the way people say they are alone when they mean they are between relationships. She meant it in the truest sense. She had not been on a date in 3 years. She had not allowed anyone close enough to learn the sound of her laugh when something actually surprised her, the way she pressed her lips together when she was thinking hard, the fact that she cried at animal documentaries but never at human stories, because human pain she had learned to compartmentalize. There was no room for softness in the version of Victoria that the world saw. The world saw the white blazers and the sharp heels and the way she walked into a room like she had already decided how everything was going to end. What the world did not see was the back seat of a black car every morning, the city scrolling past, and a silence she had not broken with a real conversation in longer than she could remember. His name was Marcus Webb. He had been her driver for 14 months before she learned his last name. That is not a criticism of her. That is just the truth of the life she had built. Drivers were part of the infrastructure of her day, like elevators and conference rooms and the assistant who brought her coffee at 8:15 without being asked. They were functional. They were professional. They were not people she thought about when she was lying in the dark staring at the ceiling. Marcus Webb made that very difficult to maintain. He was 38 years old, tall in the way that made a car feel smaller just by him sitting in it, with broad shoulders and a stillness that Victoria noticed on the very first morning. Most drivers filled silence with radio or small chatter, and she had trained herself to answer in single syllables until they stopped. Marcus did neither. He greeted her with a quiet good morning, confirmed her destination, and then drove. He drove the way some people breathe, naturally, without effort, like the road was an extension of something he already understood. She told herself she did not notice him. She noticed him immediately. It started with small things, the way he adjusted the mirror without being asked when the morning sun came in at a low angle, the way he had the temperature inside the car already set to the precise degree she preferred before she got in, which meant he had been paying attention, which meant he had been thinking about her comfort before she arrived. The way he held the door for her and looked somewhere just past her face, not at her, with the specific and practiced dignity of a man who understood exactly where the line was and had no interest in crossing it. She told herself these were the skills of a professional. She told herself a lot of things in those first months that she eventually stopped believing. The first real conversation happened in November, 11 months into his time with her. She had come out of a board meeting that had run 3 hours over schedule. She had been calm the entire time, and the calm had cost her something. She got into the car and was quiet for 4 blocks, and then, without meaning to, she said out loud, to no one in particular, "I am so tired of being the smartest person in every room I walk into." She had not meant for him to hear it. He said, without turning around, That sounds lonelier than people realize. She looked at the back of his head, the line of his neck, the way his hands rested on the wheel, easy and certain. She said, "It is." And then they were quiet again for the rest of the ride. But it was a different kind of quiet. It was the kind of quiet that happens after something true has been said. The kind that settles rather than presses. She thought about that exchange for 3 days. December came, and with it, the particular cruelty of a holiday season when your personal life is empty. The city decorated itself in lights, and the stores filled with couples and families, and the kind of warm communal joy that feels, when you are alone, like something happening on the other side of glass. Victoria worked through Christmas Eve. She had been invited to 4 parties, and she attended none of them. She sat in her office until 8 in the evening and reviewed acquisition documents and drank coffee, and did not once feel sorry for herself, because feeling sorry for yourself required a kind of stillness she could not afford. Marcus picked her up at 8:15. The streets were quiet in that rare holiday way, like accidentally walking into someone else's dream. She noticed that he had put a small pine sprig on the dashboard. Just a small one, with a red ribbon. It smelled like a forest. She looked at it for a long time. She said, "Merry Christmas, Marcus." He said, "Merry Christmas, Miss Calloway." She looked out the window at the lit-up city, and she felt something move in her chest that she did not have a name for. She pressed it down, the way she pressed everything down, efficient and practiced and without ceremony. But it stayed. It was still there when she got home. It was still there when she poured the wine she would not drink and stood at her window looking down at the street below where the world was still alive and warm and moving. January arrived like a correction, cold and businesslike and unimpressed with sentiment. Victoria threw herself into a waterfront development project that required 70-hour weeks and a level of focus that left no room for anything else. Marcus drove her to early morning meetings and late-night site visits. He was always there, always on time, always with the temperature right and the route already planned. She began to notice other things. He read. When he waited for her, he read actual books, not a phone. Books. She saw them on the passenger seat when she got in, face down, spine up, a different one every 2 weeks. She started noting the titles without meaning to. History, biography, architecture. A novel once, which surprised her, and when she mentioned it, he said simply that someone he respected had recommended it, and he made it a habit to read what people he respected recommended. She asked who had recommended it. He said his daughter. She had not known he had a daughter. She did not know why that information rearranged something inside her. It just did. It made him more fully himself, more present in a way that she had been carefully not allowing him to be. His daughter was 9 years old. Her name was Amara. Obsessed with marine biology, she had recently informed him with great authority that octopuses have 3 hearts, and he had told her that seemed like too many for one creature, and she had told him that it seemed like exactly the right amount. Victoria thought about that for a long time. She thought about how long it had been since she had felt like she had even one working one. February was when things began to shift in a way she could no longer explain away with professionalism or routine. It was not a dramatic shift. It was slower than that, and more inevitable. The way a tide moves, not in a single instant, but in the accumulation of small, consistent changes that you only recognize as change when you look back from a distance. She started arriving at the car a little earlier than she needed to. She started lingering in the lobby of her building for an extra moment before pushing through the doors, and she could not have explained what she was doing except that she was aware of it, and that awareness made her jaw tighten the way it always did when she encountered something she could not control. She started talking to him, not about anything significant, Not at first. Small things. The book she had seen on his seat, a news story she had read that morning, a question about the best route to a new location. He answered all of it with the same measured quality, thoughtful and direct, and never presumptuous, never more than she had invited. And that restraint was its own kind of presence, its own way of taking up space in her mind. One morning in late February, she got into the car, and he looked at her in the rearview mirror and said, "Rough morning?" She said, "What makes you say that?" He said, "You're holding your coffee cup with both hands." She looked down at her hands. She was, in fact, gripping her coffee cup with both hands, white-knuckled, in the way she held things when she was working through something she could not resolve. She said, "Presentation to the city council at noon. They're going to push back on the waterfront permits." He said, "Are you ready?" She said, "I'm always ready." He said, "I meant, are you ready in the way that feels like yourself, not just ready in the way that gets you through?" She stared at the back of his head, at the mirror where his eyes met hers for half a second, and then returned to the road. She said, "That is a very perceptive question." He said, "You've been working 20-hour days for 6 weeks. Even machines need maintenance." She almost laughed. She did not laugh often in the car. She did not laugh often anywhere. But something about the way he said it, so straightforward and without performance, made something in her chest loosen. She said, "I'll take that under advisement." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She looked out the window and she was smiling. She was looking away specifically so he would not see it. She did not know that he saw it anyway, in the mirror. The slight curve of her mouth, the way her grip on the coffee cup relaxed. He faced forward and said nothing else, and said it in a way that felt like everything. March brought rain, and the city turned gray and soft, and the waterfront project reached a critical phase that had Victoria in back-to-back negotiations that sometimes lasted until midnight. Marcus was always there when she came out. Always. She would push through the heavy glass doors of whatever building she had been inside, and the car would be at the curb, engine running, and she would get in, and he would pull into traffic without needing to be told where to go, because by now he knew her schedule the way you know a song you have heard enough times to carry inside you. One night she came out at 11:45 in hard rain, tired in the way that goes below the body into something closer to the center of things. She got in the car and said nothing, and he said nothing, and they drove through the wet city in silence. The rain on the roof made a sound like white noise. She realized somewhere around the third traffic light that she felt more rested in this silence than she had felt in her apartment in months. She was being carried somewhere by someone she trusted. She had not trusted anyone in a very long time. The thought arrived so quietly that she almost did not catch it. She almost let it pass the way she let most things pass, efficiently and without examination. But she was tired enough that her defenses were lower than usual, and the thought stayed, and she let herself look at it. She trusted him. Not just with her calendar or her route, though she trusted him with those things too. She trusted him with herself, with the parts of herself that showed through the cracks when the performance got heavy. The silence she needed after a hard day, and the specific quality of that silence she could only find in his car. She sat with that for a long time. He drove. The rain came down. She got home that night and stood in her kitchen for a long time looking at nothing in particular. She was examining something inside herself with the same precision she brought to balance sheets and acquisition models. She was looking at the shape of what she felt and trying to determine what it was. She knew what it was. She was not ready to name it yet. April was when he learned her coffee order was not what she actually wanted. It was a small thing. Such a small thing. She always ordered black coffee, no sugar, no cream. It was professional. It was efficient. It was the coffee of a person who did not have time for preferences. One morning, she was in the back seat reviewing documents when Marcus stopped at her usual place and came back with her usual order. And as she took the cup, she caught the scent of something else, something warm and slightly sweet. And she looked over, and he had a coffee with cream, a regular human coffee. And the difference was so striking in that moment that something cracked open in her. She said without thinking, "Is that actually good?" He said, "You want to try it?" She hesitated. The hesitation was enormous. It was not about coffee. They both understood it was not about coffee. It was about the gap between them, the professional distance that existed for good reasons, the line she had never crossed in 14 months, the line she had convinced herself she never wanted to cross. She said, "Yes." He handed her his cup. Their fingers did not touch. The space where they almost touched was charged in a way that she felt in her wrists, in the back of her throat. She tasted the coffee. It was warm and sweet, and completely different from anything she had allowed herself. She said, "That's much better than mine." He said, "Most things people actually want are." She looked at him. He was looking at the road. His profile was precise and still, and she studied it for 3 full seconds before she looked back down at her documents. She went back to black coffee the next day. She did not know why. Maybe because the other option scared her. She switched to cream and no sugar the week after that. She told herself it was just a preference. May arrived with heat, and the city opened up the way it does when winter finally releases it, windows down, and music from open doors and people sitting on stoops, and the particular urban joy of a city remembering what it is when it is warm. She asked him one morning what he did on weekends. He said he took Amara to the park on Saturday mornings, to the Natural History Museum sometimes, to the library on Sundays because she liked the reading programs they ran for kids her age. He said it simply, without embellishment, the way he said everything. But the picture it painted was so vivid and warm that she could almost feel the Saturday morning light in it. She said, "You're a good father." He said, "I try to show up. That seems to be most of it." She thought about that for a long time, about showing up, about the number of people in her life for whom she had not shown up because she had been somewhere else, in a meeting, on a call, inside a version of herself that did not have room for the texture of someone else's life. She said, "I don't think I know how to show up for people." He said, "You're one of the most present people I've ever driven." She said, "That's different." He said, "Is it?" She did not answer. She looked out the window. The city was full of people showing up for each other, buying coffee for someone, holding a door, sitting close on a bench in the warm morning air. She watched them. She said, quietly, mostly to herself, "I wouldn't know where to start." He said, "You started already. You're just not counting it." She turned and looked at him. He was watching the road. His hands were easy on the wheel. He said nothing else. She felt something she had no professional vocabulary for. Something warm and unresolved and larger than she had been prepared for. June came, and with it a night that changed everything. She had been at a charity gala, the kind of event she attended because visibility required it, in a black dress and heels that she wore like armor, and a smile she had perfected over years of being looked at. She had networked and spoken and smiled, and presented the version of Victoria Calloway that the world was accustomed to. And by 10 o'clock she was hollowed out in the particular way that performing yourself in public for 3 hours produces. Marcus pulled up to the venue, and she got into the car, and she said nothing, and he said nothing. And they drove, and she looked out the window at the nighttime city, and she was so tired of being alone inside herself that she felt it physically, a weight in the center of her chest, something pressing. She said, "Marcus." He said, "Yes." She said, "Do you ever get lonely?" A pause. Not a long one. Just enough to mean the question was being taken seriously. He said, "Yes." She said, "Even though you have a Mara?" He said, "Loneliness is not about being alone. It's about not being known." She felt the back of her eyes go hot, and she pressed down on it immediately, the reflex of someone who has cried in private for so long that the reflex to not cry in public has become physical. She said, "That's exactly it." He said, "You know more than you let people see." She said, "That's the problem." He said, "Or the beginning of the solution." She looked at the back of his head, at the mirror. His eyes found hers for a moment, briefly, and then returned to the road. But in that moment there was something direct and clear and without pretense, and she did not look away in time, and he did not either. They arrived at her building. He stopped the car. He came around and opened the door, and she stood on the pavement, and the night was warm, and the city hummed around them, and she looked at him. Really looked at him, the full length of looking that she had been carefully not allowing herself for months. She said, "Thank you. For tonight. For all of it." He said, "Good night, Miss Calloway." She said, "Victoria." A pause, smaller than the last one. He said, "Good night, Victoria." She walked into her building and rode the elevator to the 32nd floor and stood in her dark apartment with her heels still on, and she pressed her hand flat against the window glass and looked out at the city, and she understood with complete and simple clarity that she was in love with her driver. She understood it the way you understand a fact you have known for a long time but have only just allowed yourself to say. She stood there for a long time. She did not know what to do with it. She did not have a protocol for this. She had a protocol for everything in her professional life. A decision tree, a risk assessment, a mitigation strategy. She had none of that for this. She had only the weight of it, and the warmth of it, and the terrifying openness of it, that it was real, and she could not manage it into something smaller. She went to sleep eventually. She lay in the dark, and she thought about his voice saying her name. Victoria. Simple. Like it had always been his to say. She thought about his daughter, who believed 3 hearts was exactly the right amount. She thought about what it would mean to show up for someone. She thought about the shape of the space she had been keeping empty for so long, and how, without her permission, it had taken the exact dimensions of a person she had been quietly watching for 14 months. She closed her eyes. The city was quiet outside. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel alone. In the morning she got into the car, and he said good morning, and she said good morning, and he handed her a coffee with cream and no sugar before she asked, and their fingers touched this time. Actually touched, the briefest graze of warmth, and neither of them mentioned it, and neither of them forgot it. They drove into the city as the sun came up over the buildings and turned everything gold. She looked at the mirror. He was watching the road. She looked out the window and she let herself smile, completely, without managing it, without making it smaller. Something had begun. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing, in the air, in the light, in the way the world seemed, for the first time in years, like it was tilting very slightly in her direction. July was a slow and golden unraveling. The careful professional structure that had governed their interactions began to yield. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the way a carefully held posture slowly releases when a person finally feels safe enough to let their shoulders down. She started asking him things. Not professional things, not logistical things, real things. She asked him how he had gotten into driving, and he told her about the years before, a stint in the military, followed by a contracting position that paid well but left him empty, followed by a period after Amara's mother left, when he had needed something with clear parameters and reliable hours, and the space to think. And driving had given him all three. He said it without self-pity, the way he said everything, as a simple account of the geography of his life. She told him things too, about growing up with a father who measured everything in outcomes, about the early years of the company when she was 26 and trying to convince 50-year-old investors that she knew what she was doing, and the specific loneliness of competence in a room full of people who expected you to fail. He listened the way people do when they are genuinely interested and not simply waiting for their turn to speak. One afternoon she said, "You're the only person I've talked to like this in years." He said, "I know." She said, "Does that bother you?" He said, "It honors me." August was when she said the thing she had been not saying for months. They were parked outside a building where she had a 2-hour site meeting, and it had run short, and she had come back to the car 45 minutes early, and he was sitting in the front seat with his book, and he put it down when she got in, and she sat in the back seat, and there was a long quiet. And then she said it. She said, "I think about you when you're not here." She said it to the window, not to him directly, to the glass, to the city on the other side of the glass, to the version of herself that was brave enough to say it, even if she could not look at him while she said it. A long silence. He said, "I know." She said, "Is that something you're going to say anything about?" He said, "I think about you too. I have for a while." She turned from the window. He was turned slightly in his seat, just slightly, not fully facing her, somewhere between forward and toward her, that careful balance of a man who is not overstepping and not retreating. He said, "I want to be honest with you about what that means and what it complicates." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I work for you. That is a real thing, not a minor thing." She said, "I know." He said, "And you are someone who has not let many people in. I can see that clearly. And I am not interested in being something you let in and then regret." She said, "You're the least complicated thing in my life." He said, "That is both the kindest thing you've said to me and also a little frightening." She laughed. A real one. The surprised kind. The kind she could not manage or prepare. It came out of her and filled the car, and she covered her mouth briefly with her hand, and he was smiling. She could see the side of his face, and he was smiling. And the combined weight of both of those things, her laughing and him smiling at the sound of it, was almost too much. She said, "I don't want to be your employer right now. Can we just be two people in a car for a minute?" He said, "We've been two people in a car for 14 months. She said, "You know what I mean." He said, "I do." He turned to face her, fully. He turned in his seat and looked at her directly, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away, and the space between them was charged with everything that had been accumulating for all those miles and all those mornings and all those silences that had said more than most people's words. He said, "What do you want, Victoria?" She said, "I want to not be alone. I want it to be you that I'm not alone with." He held her gaze. His eyes were steady and dark and full of an intelligence she had always felt, but never looked at this directly. He said, "Then we figure out the rest." She nodded. The nod of someone who has made a decision and is not taking it back. He turned back to face the front. He picked up her coffee from the holder and passed it to her. And this time their fingers held, warm and deliberate. And then he released it, and she held the cup. And something that had been quietly building for 14 months, finally, simply, arrived. September arrived, and with it the beginning of something neither of them had a name for yet, but both understood completely. They began to build small rituals. 10 minutes of parked car in the early light before her first meeting. She would talk about what was ahead, and he would listen, and sometimes ask a single question that rearranged the whole thing. She began approaching difficult days differently, because she had spent 10 minutes considering them out loud with someone who was not trying to solve them for her. She began to bring him things. A book she had read and thought he would find interesting. A pastry from a place not on any of their usual routes. She would leave these things on the seat beside her and not make anything of it. And he would find them and say thank you, simply. One evening she said, without looking away from the window, "When was the last time someone took care of you?" A pause. He said, "It's been a while." She said, "I want to be better at that, at taking care of people." He said, "You're better than you think." She said, "You're generous." He said, "I'm accurate." She turned and looked at him in the mirror. His eyes found hers. They held there for a moment that was longer than a glance and shorter than everything she wanted to say. She said, "Marcus." He said, "Yeah." She said, "I'm glad you're the one who shows up." He said, "Me too." October came and she took a weekend, the first one she had taken in 2 years. She did not tell anyone at work. She turned her phone to emergency only, and she did not open her email. And she sat in her apartment on Saturday morning with the window open and the October air coming in, and she thought about what she wanted her life to actually look like. She had built so much. She had won so many rooms. And she was sitting alone in a beautiful apartment on a Saturday morning, and the most alive she had felt in years was in the back seat of a car talking to a man who listened like it mattered. She picked up her phone. She sent him a message. It said, "Are you free this afternoon?" He replied within a few minutes. He said, "I'm with Amara in the morning. Free by 2. She said, "Would you want to walk somewhere?" "Just walk, no destination." A pause, then, "Yes." They walked for 3 hours through the park, along the water, back through a neighborhood where old buildings had window boxes full of October flowers. She wore jeans and flat shoes, a version of herself the city had never seen. They talked about everything. His time in the military, her father and the inheritance, Amara and how he had driven to the aquarium 3 times in 1 month because she had decided it was her personal laboratory. She laughed so much that afternoon that her chest hurt. They stopped at a bench near the water and sat and watched the light change on the surface and said nothing for a while, and the nothing was full and warm. He said, "Thank you for this." She said, "For what? You walked 3 hours." He said, "For asking. For stepping outside the car." She understood what he meant. She said, It took me a while, he said. Worth the wait. She looked at him. The light was doing something particular to the afternoon, turning everything amber and soft. And he was sitting with his forearms on his knees and his profile open to the sky, and he looked like the most settled person she had ever sat beside, and she felt something in her chest so large and warm and complete that it was almost frightening. She said, "Marcus." He turned to look at her. She said, "I know we're figuring it out. I just want you to know that I'm not confused about what I feel. I've been confused about a lot of things. I'm not confused about this." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of looking that is its own answer. He said, "Neither am I." The October light held them there, on that bench, by that water, in that city that had no idea what was happening in this quiet corner of itself. Two people who had been alone in different ways arriving, at last, at something that was the opposite of that. She thought about his daughter and 3 hearts. She thought that maybe 3 was not too many after all. Maybe this was what the third one was for. The city was golden around them. The water moved. The afternoon held still. She reached over and placed her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them, and he turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that as the light changed and the city carried on around them. And for the first time in a very long time, Victoria Calloway had nothing left to prove and nowhere she needed to be. And someone beside her who knew that and stayed anyway. That was where the story of her loneliness ended, and something altogether different began. November arrived the way it always does in this city, without apology, stripping the last color from the trees and replacing it with a gray that presses down on everything from above like a hand on a shoulder that is not entirely unkind. Victoria had always loved November. She had never been able to explain why. Something about the starkness of it. Something about the way it refused to pretend. She thought about that now, sitting in the back seat on a Tuesday morning, watching the bare trees along the park boulevard scroll past the window. And she thought that she understood November better than she used to. It was the month that stopped performing. It showed you exactly what was there once the decoration came down. She was looking at exactly what was there. Marcus was quiet in the front seat, the way he always was in the mornings, present and unhurried. And she watched the back of his head and thought about October, about the bench and the water, and his hand turning over to hold hers. And she felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt before. Not the sharp restlessness of wanting something you do not have. The other thing. The warmth of knowing something is already there. She said, "What are you thinking about?" He glanced at her in the mirror, a half smile in his eyes. He said, "The route, there's construction on 7th. She said, "That is the least interesting possible answer." He said, "You asked what I was thinking. I told you." She said, "I was hoping for something more revealing." He said, "I was also thinking that it's been 3 weeks since October and you haven't said anything about it." She was quiet for a moment. The city moved past the windows. She said, "I didn't know what to say." He said, "You could start with what you want." She looked at his profile in the mirror, the clean line of his jaw, the steadiness he carried like a fact about himself. She said, "I want to keep going. I don't want to pretend October didn't happen, and I don't want to manage it into something smaller than it was." He said, "Then we don't." She said, "It's not simple." He said, "No." She said, "You still work for me. That's still a real thing." He said, "It is." She said, "I don't know how to do this without it being complicated." He said, "I think you do know. I think you're just used to being the person who figures everything out before she starts. This doesn't work that way." She looked out the window. She said, "That is deeply inconvenient for me." He said, "I know." She said quietly, "I haven't wanted anything this much in a long time. That scares me more than the complication does." A pause. He navigated around a delivery truck on the corner, easy and unhurried. Then he said, "Being scared of something real is different from being scared of something that might hurt you. One means it matters. The other means you're in danger." She said, "Which one is this?" He said, "You know which one." She did know. She looked out the window at November moving past, and she allowed herself, for the first time in a very long time, to not have a plan. To be in something without knowing how it ended. To trust the road even though she could not see around the next corner. It felt, she thought, like driving at night when the headlights only show you the next 50 feet. You drive anyway. You trust the lights. She said, "Dinner. Not as your employer. Somewhere." He said, "When?" She said, "Saturday." He said, "I'll have Amara until 6. She said, "7 then." He said, "7. Simple. The most significant thing she had agreed to in years settled into the air like it had always been waiting to be said. She looked out the window, and the November city looked entirely different than it had 20 minutes ago. More real. More like something she was inside of, rather than watching from behind glass. The dinner was at a small Italian place in a neighborhood that neither of them would run into anyone from her professional life. She had chosen it deliberately, and then felt vaguely embarrassed about the deliberateness, and then decided the embarrassment was a small price. She got there first. She sat at the table by the window, and she was wearing a dark green dress that she had not worn in 2 years, and she had left her phone in her bag, which was something she almost never did. And she was sitting with her hands folded on the table and watching the door when he walked in. He was in dark clothing, simple, and without the uniform formality of his driving hours. He looked like himself in a way that was different and more complete. She watched him come through the door and look for her and find her at the window. And she felt the full weight of the moment, the strangeness and rightness of it together, like a key that was both new and exactly the shape of the lock. He sat down across from her. He said, "You look different." She said, "You look different too." He said, "Good different?" She said, "Very good different." They talked for 4 hours. The food came and was eaten, and the plates were taken away, and wine was poured, and the restaurant filled and then quietly emptied around them, and they did not notice any of it. They talked the way people talk when they have been almost talking for a long time, and the almost is finally gone. She told him things she had not told anyone. About the night she almost walked away from the company. About the cost of the years alone, and how she had convinced herself it was a trade she had made deliberately, and how she was not certain anymore that she had made it deliberately at all. He listened, and when he spoke, it was with the same precision he brought to everything, choosing his words the way a craftsman chooses tools, nothing wasted, everything exactly right. He told her about his daughter's mother, the slow dissolution of that relationship, not dramatic, not angry, just two people who had grown in directions that no longer intersected, and the particular grief of that, the quiet kind that does not have an obvious shape to mourn. He told her about the mornings he drove before dawn when the city was empty and he was the only person on certain streets, and there was something in that, in being inside a sleeping city that he had never been able to put words to, but had never wanted to lose. She said, "That's why you're good at the silence." He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You're comfortable in it. You don't fill it because you're afraid of it. You fill it when there's something worth saying." He said, "Is that unusual?" She said, "You have no idea." He looked at her across the table. The restaurant was nearly empty now, and the light was low and warm, and she could see his face completely. And she let herself look the way she had not let herself look in all the months they had been learning each other in the car, through mirrors and glances and the careful sideways knowledge of two people managing the distance between them. She said, "I keep waiting for this to feel like a mistake." He said, "Does it?" She said, "No. That's what's strange. It keeps feeling more like the opposite." He said, "Like a correction." She said, "Yes, exactly like that." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. The same gesture she had made on the bench in October returned to her now. And she turned her hand over the way he had and held on. And the restaurant was quiet around them, and the street outside was wet and lit, and the city was doing what cities do, carrying on enormously and indifferently around two people who were sitting very still at a small table and holding each other's hand and understanding that something had changed. December came back around, and with it the particular symmetry of returning to the place where things had begun. A year had passed. 1 full year since the Christmas morning with the pine sprig on the dashboard and the feeling in her chest she did not have a name for. She had a name for it now. She sat in the back seat on Christmas Eve, and there was, again, a small pine sprig on the dashboard, the same ribbon. She looked at it for a long time. She said, "You remembered." He said, "I remember everything." She believed him. She had come to understand that about him over the course of a year and 4 months of early mornings and late nights and everything in between. He was a person who paid attention, not as performance, not as strategy, just as his natural way of moving through the world, taking it seriously, honoring it with his full presence. She said, "Merry Christmas, Marcus." He said, "Merry Christmas, Victoria." The name. Her name in his voice. Still the thing that opened something in her chest that she had spent most of her adult life keeping shut. She looked out the window at the holiday city. The same lights, the same communal warmth that had once felt like something happening on the other side of glass. She was no longer on the other side of it. She said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "A year ago, I got in this car on Christmas Eve, and you had put a pine sprig on the dashboard, and I felt something that I pressed down immediately because I didn't know what to do with it. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it was the holiday and the hour and the empty apartment waiting for me." She paused. "It wasn't nothing." He said, "I know." She said, "I know you know. I just wanted to say it out loud, in the actual air, not in my head." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because the things I keep in my head don't get to be real. The things I say out loud do." A long quiet. The city moved past outside. Then he said, It wasn't nothing for me either, that night. It's been a long time since I put something on a dashboard for someone. She said, "What made you do it?" He said, "I thought you might need something small and real. You spend a lot of time with things that are large and serious. I thought something small might be a relief." She stared at the back of his head, the line of him, the quiet, extraordinary fact of him. She said, "You were right." He said, "I usually am." She laughed, that real laugh, the unmanaged one, and it filled the car the way it always did, and she saw his face shift in the mirror, and she knew without seeing fully that he was smiling. She said, "That is an unreasonable amount of confidence." He said, "I have evidence." She shook her head and looked out the window, and the city was beautiful in the December night, all light and reflection. And she thought about the person she had been a year ago, sitting in this same seat on this same night, and she felt something she could only describe as tenderness for that person, that lonely armored woman with her untouched wine and her empty apartment, who had been so close to something she could not yet see. She saw it now. She was inside it. She said, "Come upstairs tonight." The words were out before she had fully decided to say them, but she found, once they were in the air, that she did not want to take them back. A pause, longer than his usual pauses. He said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I've been sure of very few things with such complete certainty." He said, "That is a very Victoria Calloway way to say yes." She said, "I contain multitudes." He said, "I'm beginning to understand that." He drove. She sat with her hands quiet in her lap and felt, for the first time in memory, entirely calm about something she had decided. They arrived at her building. He parked. He came around and opened her door, and she stepped out onto the pavement, and the December night was cold and clear, and the city was lit like a celebration, and she stood looking at him in the direct and uncomplicated way she had learned to allow herself. She said, "Ready?" He said, "Past ready." They went up together. Her apartment was dark when she unlocked the door, and she did not turn on the overhead light. She turned on the lamp in the corner, the one that threw warm gold across the room. And the apartment looked different in that light, less like an office extension, less like the place where she prepared for tomorrow. It looked like somewhere a person could be at rest. He stood in the middle of it and looked around. She watched him take it in. The floor-to-ceiling windows with the city spread out below. The books arranged not by color or size, but in some private system only she understood. The single photograph on the shelf, her at 28 on the roof of the first building she ever bought, before it was renovated, squinting into the sun, laughing at something off-frame. He said, "You were happy there." She looked at the photograph. She said, "I was terrified. I had just signed a loan that could have ended me." He said, "You're laughing." She said, "I laugh when I'm terrified, apparently." He looked at her. She looked back. The apartment was quiet around them, and the city moved outside the windows. And all of the months, and all of the mornings, and all of the careful distance, and the slow dissolving of that distance were present in the room with them. Everything they had built toward this exact moment, standing in a warm-lit room on Christmas Eve with nowhere else to be. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and his eyes were everything she had been reading for a year in mirrors and glances, fully visible now, nothing managed. He said, Can I? She said. Yes. He brought his hand up and touched her face, his palm against her jaw, and the touch was so careful and so certain at the same time that she felt it through her entire body, this specific quality of being held by someone who has been paying attention for a long time. He kissed her. It was not a beginning. That was the thing she understood immediately. It was the arrival of something that had been traveling toward this moment for a very long time. The word at the end of a sentence building for 14 months. The resolution of every loop opened in back seats and rainy nights and October benches and all the silences that had carried more than silence. She kissed him back, her hand against his chest, feeling the steady certainty of him under her palm, and the city spread out behind them, and the lamp threw its warm gold, and none of that touched them. When they finally separated, she kept her forehead against his, and her eyes closed for a moment, and she breathed. He said quietly, "You okay?" She said, "I'm the most okay I've been in years." He laughed, not his usual quiet smile, an actual laugh, low and warm and surprised, and she opened her eyes to watch it happen on his face, to see him caught off guard for once, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in recent memory. She said, "You should do that more." He said, "Do what?" She said, "That. What just happened on your face?" He said, "You surprised me." She said, "Good. You surprise me constantly. It's only fair." They stood together in her apartment with the city below and the night around them, and something that had taken a very long time to arrive sitting in the room between them, fully present, warm and solid and real. January came and was cold and certain, and she did not mind it. She did not mind it because the cold now had a different quality. Not the cold of an empty apartment and an untouched glass of wine and a silence that pressed. The cold was just weather now, just the season, something outside that had no access to what was inside. She began to learn him the way you learn someone when the professional structure falls away. She learned that he made coffee slowly and deliberately, a ritual he did not rush, that he carried a small notebook and wrote observations in it, a line here and a phrase there, the way a person takes a photograph except with words. That he was meticulous about things that mattered and completely unbothered about things that did not. He learned her too. That she read the last page of every book before she started it, not to know the ending but to understand the emotional key. That she hummed to herself when she was happy, a low, quiet sound she was not aware she was making, and when he mentioned it she stopped for exactly 48 hours before she started again. He learned the sound of her sleeping. She was not easy to know. Old habits of distance surfaced sometimes, the instinct to manage rather than feel, to assess rather than trust. He was patient with it the way he was patient with everything, not passively but actively, the way a person holds open a door and keeps holding it, communicating through the holding that it will stay open as long as needed. She loved him for that patience most of all. She had not said that yet, not in the actual air. It was February when she said it. They were in the car, where else? She had meetings all day and he had driven her from one to the next through a gray and cold February city, and now it was evening and they were heading home, and the streets were wet from sleet, and the city glowed amber and blue in the winter dark, and she was sitting in the back seat watching the city and feeling, underneath the tiredness, the specific warmth of a person who knows they are going somewhere that matters. She said, without planning it, without a decision, the way the truest things always came out of her in this car. "I love you." She said it to the window, to the wet amber city outside. A pause, not a long one. He said, "I know." She said, "That's it? That's what you have?" He said, I've known for a while. I was waiting to say it until you did. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because it needed to come from you first. You needed to hear yourself say it." She sat with that. He was right. She did need to hear herself say it. She needed to hear that she was capable of it, that it was a word she could form and release, that it did not break anything on its way out. She said, "Say it then." He said, "I love you, Victoria." She turned from the window and looked at the mirror, and his eyes found hers and held there, steady and warm and direct, and she felt the word land in her chest and stay. She said, "That took me a long time." He said, "I know." She said, "It won't again." He said, "I know that too." She looked back out the window. The city moved past. The sleet had softened into something closer to rain, and the streets were shining, and the lights were scattered across the wet surface like a second city, a reflection city, upside down and wavering. She said, "Amara was right." He said, "About what?" She said, 3 hearts is exactly the right amount." She heard him laugh, low and warm, filling the car, and she sat in the back seat of the black car in the winter city, and she laughed too, and the city moved past outside, indifferent and beautiful and enormous, carrying on as cities do, and in the middle of all of it, inside the warmth of a car with rain on the roof and a man who saw her completely and a laugh that no longer needed to be managed, Victoria Calloway was, for the first time in longer than she could trace, genuinely, entirely, unreservedly, alive. Spring came the way it always does, argumentative and uneven, cold one morning and warm the next. Victoria had always found it irritating. She liked things that knew what they were. She did not find it irritating this year. She found it familiar. The uncertainty of it, the not yet settled quality of a thing still becoming what it will be. She recognized it because she had been living in something like that herself, and she had learned, with considerable difficulty and Marcus's patience, that unsettled was not the same as unstable, that becoming was not the same as lost. He had taught her that without meaning to, simply by being a person who was entirely himself while also being someone she had watched become more over the course of knowing him. He had taken on a teaching certification over the winter, evening classes, 3 nights a week, something he had been planning before he met her. She found out not because he told her, but because she had seen the textbooks in the car and asked. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "I wasn't sure what it would be yet." She said, "You could have told me it was uncertain." He said, "You were going through a lot. I didn't want to add to the list of things you were thinking about." She said, "I want to be on the list of people you tell things to." He looked at her. He said, "You are. That's a different list from the one I was protecting you from." She had thought about that for a long time, about the lists people made, about the difference between the people you lean on and the people you protect, about the particular intimacy of being moved from one list to the other. She said, "You can put me on both." He said, "I know that now." The certification was for secondary school, history and civics. He wanted to teach. He had always wanted to teach. He said it as though it were a simple fact, which for him it was. And she sat with the simplicity of it and thought about how long it had taken her to understand the difference between a life built for others and a life built for yourself, and how he had known that difference for much longer than she had. She said. When you finish, what happens? He said. I'll teach. She said. And the driving? A pause. He said. That's part of what I wanted to talk to you about. She said. Okay. He said. I want to make sure that when that changes, you and I don't change with it. That whatever we are, it's not dependent on the structure of me working for you. She said. It isn't. He said. I know. I needed to say it out loud. She smiled. She said. Now you're doing it. He said. Doing what? She said. Saying things out loud so they become real. He looked at her. He was smiling. He said, I learned it from someone. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, just for a moment, and he put his hand over hers briefly, and then she pulled back, because he was driving, because some things had not changed, and some things never would, and she was glad for that, for the parts of them that had started in this car and would always be most themselves here, in this particular moving quiet. Summer arrived and Victoria Calloway walked through the warm world differently. People who knew her professionally noticed something they could not name. Her assistant said she seemed lighter. A board member said she seemed settled. She accepted both without explanation. She was settled. She was lighter. She had stopped carrying so much of herself alone. On a Saturday in July, she took Amara to the aquarium. Marcus was at a morning session for his certification, and Amara was 9 years old now and had graduated in her own estimation from interested observer to serious marine biologist. And when Victoria had mentioned the aquarium in passing, Amara had looked at her with an expression so similar to her father's steady directness that Victoria had laughed out loud. She had asked Marcus first. He had said yes in the way he said yes to things he had already considered. They spent 4 hours there. Amara explained things with the confident authority of someone who has read every available source and is now frustrated by how slowly the rest of the world is catching up. Victoria listened, actually listened, not politely, not performing interest, but genuinely fascinated by this small person who moved through the world with her father's certainty and her own particular fire. At the jellyfish exhibit, Amara pressed her face against the glass and said, without looking away from the slow, illuminated movement inside, "My dad likes you a lot." Victoria said, "I like him a lot too." Amara said, "He smiles more." Victoria said, "I've noticed that." Amara said, still watching the jellyfish, "You smile more too. I've seen your picture from before, on his phone from work things. You looked like this." She made a face of careful, controlled pleasantness. Victoria said, "That's very accurate." Amara said, "You look different now, like you stopped being afraid of something." Victoria looked at this 9-year-old in the blue light of the jellyfish tank and felt something so profound move through her that she had to look away for a moment. She said, "You're very perceptive." Amara said, "I know. Dad says it too." They ate lunch in the museum cafe, and Amara told her at considerable length about bioluminescence and the pressure conditions in the deep ocean and a documentary she had watched 4 times. Victoria ate her sandwich and listened and asked questions that were genuine, and Amara answered them with the delighted energy of someone who does not often get to talk about what they love to someone who is actually listening. On the way home, Amara fell asleep against Victoria's arm, completely without ceremony, the way a child falls asleep when they feel safe. Victoria sat very still and looked out at the summer city and felt the small, warm weight against her side, and thought about her life a year ago, the penthouse, and the untouched wine, and the silence, and then the shape of it right now. Home. She had started thinking of it that way. His apartment on Sundays, hers on weeknights. The car. Always the car. Mornings and evenings, the original geography of their becoming, still the place where they were most themselves. She thought about what her father would have said. He would have called it inefficient, a distraction. She thought her father had been wrong about a number of things. Marcus was at the apartment when she got back, cooking something that smelled like his mother's recipe. Amara woke when the cab stopped and went inside, and went immediately to tell her father about the bioluminescence at full volume. Victoria stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him listen to his daughter the way he had always listened to her. He caught her eye over Amara's head, and something passed between them that had no name and needed none. She said, "She ate an entire sandwich and talked for 40 minutes about pressure gradients." He said, "That's her at half capacity." She said, "I know. It was wonderful." He looked at her. That look, the one she had first seen in a rearview mirror, and had spent 14 months pretending not to see. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. I had an extraordinarily good afternoon." Amara, who had continued narrating to the middle distance, turned around and said, "She asked good questions. Most grown-ups ask bad ones." Victoria said, "High praise." Amara said, "It is," with the serene certainty of someone who sees no reason to be modest about their standards. Victoria laughed. Marcus laughed. Amara looked between them and accepted their laughter with equanimity. After Amara went to sleep, they sat together in the quiet apartment, and the summer city hummed outside, and Victoria leaned against him on the couch, and he put his arm around her, and she felt, with the simple certainty that had replaced the endless assessment she had once brought to everything, that this was right. Not perfect, not without the days when her old habits surfaced, and she retreated before catching herself. Not without the moments of friction that any real thing contains. But right, in the way that right feels when it is not manufactured but simply arrived at, after a long journey, after all the miles. She said, "I was thinking." He said, "About?" She said, "About the driving, about what changes." He said, "What about it?" She said, "When you finish the certification, when you're ready to teach, I want to make sure you know that my support for that is not contingent on anything. It's not complicated by us. I want you to do it." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm saying it out loud." He said, "So it becomes real." She said, "So it becomes real." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The school district posted a position, secondary history. I've been looking at it." She said, "You should apply." He said, "I've been thinking about it." She said, "Marcus." He said, "Yeah." She said, "Apply." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She looked up at him. She said, "Don't do that." He was smiling. She could feel it even looking up from below the angle of his chin. She settled back against him, and the summer moved outside, and the apartment was warm and quiet with the quality that belongs to a place where someone is happy. She thought about the car, the 14 months of mornings and evenings and the professional distance between them, the long road from the first good morning to this. She had sat in traffic on 100 mornings, looking at the back of his head, telling herself it was nothing, knowing it was not nothing, pressing it down and carrying it anyway. The pine sprig in December, the coffee cup in February, the rainy March night. The April fingers that almost touched. October and a bench and his hand turning over. She understood something she could only understand from the other side. It had to take that long. Every mile necessary. Not because love requires suffering, but because she had needed all of it to become the person who could hold this without managing it away. He had been patient enough to wait while she did. She said, quietly, mostly to herself, "I'm glad I got in the car." He said, "What?" She said, 14 months ago I got in the car and told myself not to notice him." He said, "I noticed you immediately." She said, "I know. The mirror. You always watched where you were going and you watched me too. I chose not to see it, but I saw it." He said, "And now?" She said, "Now I see everything." He held her a little closer. She let him. Outside the window, the city went on being the city, beautiful and indifferent and alive. And inside the apartment, on a summer night at the end of a long and necessary road, two people who had been alone in different ways sat together in the quiet and the warmth, and neither of them felt alone. And that was everything, and that was enough, and that was the whole of the story they had been, without knowing it, driving toward all along.